Welcome, everybody. It's a great honor for me to be here as a guest of the Polin Institute of Warsaw. I've been asked to give a talk on the topic of divine presence and ethics, Hasidim, Mitnagdim, and modern Jewish thought. The Polin Institute is really a phenomenal place. And a few years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a part of a summer there and do a conference which turned into a book on the Rebbe Piazetzna. And so when the request came, I couldn't say no at all. So thank you for being here. And I want to encourage people, if you have questions as I start, please text them to Ariel Mays, who will be our, what's the word, bouncer?
Bouncer, her moderator.
Ariel Mays, our moderator. And if need be, I'll take questions during, but I'll also leave some time at the end for questions and conversations. Okay.
Don, before we get started, can I introduce you?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So, good evening, everyone. It's really my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Don Seaman, an associate professor at Emory University. He has a joint appointment with the Department of Religion and the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. He received his PhD in anthropology from Harvard University in 1997 and taught previously at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has published an array of many different essays in both anthropology of religion and Jewish thought, especially in Hasidism. He's the author of One People, One Blood, Ethiopian Israelis and the Return to Judaism, published by Rutgers University Press. He's the co-editor of the Contemporary Anthropology of Religion series at Palgrave. He's the co-editor of the new volume, Hasidism, Suffering and Renewal, The Holocaust and Pre-Holocaust Legacy of Rabbi Kalonymus Shapira, published by State University of New York Press, soon to be out in paperback, which actually, as Don said, began as a research seminar here at Polin. He's the co-editor of a forthcoming volume on existential anthropology and the study of religion, and is working on an exciting new monograph titled Neighborhood Mystics, Ethnography, and Transcendence Among Chabad Hasidim. If it wasn't enough, he and his family live in Atlanta, where he is the rabbi of the new Toko Shul. Before handing over the reins to Professor Seaman, I'd like to thank our kind hosts, Polin, the Museum of Jewish History of Polish Jews. This lecture is part of the Distinguished Lecture Series within the Global Education Outreach Program. It's made possible thanks to the Taubi Philanthropies, the William K. Bowes Jr. Foundation, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. The audience is encouraged, really welcome to ask questions through the YouTube chat, which will then be communicated to me, and I'll hope you all do so. Professor Seaman will speak this evening on the ethics and presence of God, Hasidim, Mitnagdim, and modern Jewish thought. Without further ado.
Thank you, Ariel. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's hard to know exactly where to begin. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. The modern Jewish world, if you want to think of it this way, has been for a few hundred years divided increasingly into different camps, ideological, sociological, Orthodox and Reform, and Zionist and non-Zionist, and secular and religious. And there are many different ways of cutting up that pie. But if you think about the world of Orthodox Judaism in particular, there are a few cleavages that have left their mark on the modern Jewish condition in a very, very deep way. And one of those is the cleavage that I'm going to talk a little bit about today between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. Although I want to hasten to say, I'm not really going to talk about this as a historian today, or as somebody who's trying to delineate exactly what the arguments were between the Hasidim and Mitnagdim, and there may be people in the audience who know more about that than I do. But I really want to offer some personal reflection on what this cleavage has meant to me, both in my life as a scholar and in my life as a person. And I will try to be a little bit more open and vulnerable than I normally would be in an academic talk. So please bear with me. The basic outlines are well known. The Hasidic movement blasts onto the page of Eastern European Judaism in the late 1700s. The Baal Shem Tov is the person who is identified as the founder of the movement, although historians can debate exactly what that means. His student, the Maggid of Mezrich, the great Maggid, about which Ariel Mace has written an incredible book, gathers around himself a set of students, quite diverse. Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, who gives rise to the Chabad movement, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, and many, many different figures who then go out and, forgive the expression, colonize the rest of the Jewish world, specifically Eastern Europe, on behalf of this new doctrine of Hasidism. They don't quite make it to Germany. My good friend and colleague, Marcin Wozinski, has argued that sort of the German cultural orbit is where Hasidism gets stopped. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit later. But Eastern Europe, they really take over up until the Holocaust. And their significance, both in terms of numbers and in terms of ideas, really only continues to grow. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not opposition. And from the very beginning, the Hasidic movement aroused opposition among people who eventually became known as mitnagdim or misnagdim, or as Chabadnikim like to say, menagdim. The opponents, they're known for being the opponents of Hasidism, but of course, that's not the sum total of how they saw themselves. This was a movement of rabbinic leaders, many of whom were Kabbalists or mystics themselves. This is not necessarily, as has sometimes been portrayed, a cleavage between mysticism and rationalism. I think that's something that sort of we moderns like to frame it as. The Vilna Gaon was one of the most profound Kabbalists of the last several hundred years. And it seems that he was personally responsible for much of the early opposition and fierce opposition to the Hasidic movement, leading to bans, mutual bans of excommunication, of cherem, occasional violence breaking out in local Jewish communities, but certainly argument and division that took a couple of hundred years to heal, even though they began to moderate even in the next generation. But it's really only after the Holocaust that ultra-Orthodoxy has come to seem more important to many people than those cleavages, and those cleavages, of course, still exist. Now, what's the difference between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim? There are many, many different approaches to this question. Many people have written about it. I'm only going to focus on one distinction, which I find theologically and personally and ethically very important to me, very moving to me. When Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was not yet the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was asked to define precisely what was the difference between the Hasidic and the Mitnagdic approach to Judaism in a letter that he wrote I think it was in the late 1930s, but I could be wrong about that. He said the following. He said there are 4 different ways. You can sort of map it out as a quadrant. I don't have a slide for that, but there are different ways you can think about the presence of God in the universe. One possibility, which is the Hasidic possibility, and which the Hasidim attributed also to some of the earlier Kabbalists, especially the Ari. That point of view is summed up by the Zoharic statement, Leit atar panui minei klal. Leit atar panui minei klal. There is no space empty of him. God is everywhere. And if God is everywhere, that begs the question, what's the status of everything else that we see around us? Chairs, and tables, and people, and goats, and cows, and pigs. How can God be present, in a place where there are pigs, in a place where there's suffering, in a place where there's impurity? But the answer to that question, as at least Rabbi Schneerson understood the Hasidic movement, and he's a fair authority on the subject, was that, in fact, the absence of God that we perceive is itself a kind of illusion. It's not entirely true. It's an illusion that God created for good reasons, but it's a kind of illusion in the sense that if we could see things as they truly, truly were, we would understand that there's no place empty of God, and therefore there's nothing separate from God. And in a certain sense, I'll just qualify it that way. So in a certain sense, there's nothing but God. And these were ideas that were um, um, flowing around in a lot of different directions in the 1700s. Spinoza had written what he wrote, and Mendelssohn and the German Jews had reacted very negatively towards Spinoza. I think that's one of the reasons that the Hasidic movement never quite penetrated Germany. They already had their defenses up against any kind of pantheism or panentheism. But this is a view that says not only is God present everywhere, but God's light is present everywhere at all times, in all things. And there's a sense it is all things. Alles is God, God is all, right? Whether God is everything, everything is God, everything is in God. There are many ways you could formulate this. And I don't want to get stuck on that theological point right now. Okay, the main question is whether you can perceive of a world such that there's no place empty of God at all. And if you think that that's the obvious religious position, then that might be because the Hasidim won in a certain sense. But Mitnagdim were not of one mind about this. There's some debate about what the Gaon of Vilna actually thought. So I'm just going to tell you what the Lubavitcher Rebbe said he thought. We don't have to go into the Gaon's recesses of his mind right now. But according to the Hasidic vision of the Mitnagdim, the Gaon believed in an idea that can be called Tzimtzum Kipshuta. Tzimtzum Kipshuta, literal removal of divine presence from a space in order to allow creation, in order to allow people and cows and pigs and pollution and everything else that we have around us was created by a withdrawing of God from space for the sake of the ability of world to body forth and to exist. And of course, God is in control of the world, and God's power runs throughout the world, and there's no place you can escape from God. But that's different than saying God is here. Okay, and this was a debate that predated the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. Already in the century before, they were arguing about it. And very often the argument came down to which is the more humiliating thing to say about a great king. Is it more humiliating to say about a great king that there is some domain outside of his direct presence, right? As if it's outside of his domain, which is what the Hasidim accused the Mitnagdim of believing, or is it more humiliating to a king to think of him as being present in a latrine, in places of ugliness, in places of gross immorality, in places of physicality and materiality? And the two sides were arguing it out on this basis. What is Kavod Hashem? What is the honor due to the divine? And which of these views allows us to honor God in the proper way? Okay, so these were two views that were both deeply, deeply concerned with how to speak about God. But how to speak about God, of course, in a Jewish world is always about how to pray to God, how to study Torah, how to observe commandments, how to live in the world. It was not an abstract question. It had to do with everyday rituals. What is your intentionality when you are saying Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the doxology that traditional Jews say at least twice every day? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What are you thinking about when you say that? What does oneness mean? So there's a certain view within Hasidism which says that oneness means the divine unity that encompasses everything. Because if there's anything left out of it, then that's not unity. Of course, that's not the only way to think about what unity means. Okay? There were other ways. And some of these debates go all the way back to Maimonides. And by the way, we're not exactly sure what Maimonides thought. So each of these positions can also ground themselves in readings of Maimonides and some of the medieval writers. So these are questions that, in a certain sense, go back to the very foundations of Rabbinic Judaism. Okay, certainly in the Middle Ages, but those people in the Middle Ages were also arguing about texts in the Talmud and in the Bible and earlier mystical texts and philosophical texts. So what I'm raising here, the question of, is there a space empty of God in a sense, and what does that mean to us as human beings, is not only a question that comes up in 18th century Eastern Europe. This is really a question that defines Jewish life in many, many, many different ways. And we find, by the way, Solomon Maimon, who was a Polish Jew who went to visit the early court of the Maggid of Mezrich, then later became disillusioned. He went to Berlin under the tutelage of Moses Mendelssohn. He became an enlightened Jew and not a rabbinic Jew anymore. And he says something fascinating. He says he felt that the Hasidim were Spinozans who were not willing to live with the implications of Spinoza. He says that in his autobiography. They were Spinozans in the sense that the world is an illusion, everything is God, but if everything is God, there's also a sense in which nothing is God, right? If everything is sacred, there's also a sense in which nothing is sacred. And he thought that Spinoza had taken it to the full extreme, allowing for a secularization of Jewish thought and Jewish self-identity, which, by the way, Moses Mendelssohn was aware of and didn't want any part of. Okay, there's one way of thinking about Hasidism, which I'm not going to get into right now, that it was a movement that was actually trying to mediate between these different sorts of ideas that were floating around in Europe and in the Jewish world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Pantheism or panentheism was not an idea that was new when Hasidism came on the scene. And they were aware of people like Spinoza and other great heretics of Jewish history. And the relationship between those heresies and later Hasidism is, of course, also something that both historians and Hasidim themselves argue about. And I frame it this way because, although I'm an academic scholar trained in anthropology, and I consider myself, I guess I would say, a fellow traveler of Hasidim, although I don't think it would be fair for me to call myself a Hasid, in the sense that a Hasid needs a Rebbe. And I'm not sure that I have a Rebbe in that exact sense. But I'm sympathetic to the Hasidic movement, and I don't necessarily always take it for granted that the academic response to a question like this is the right response, or the most important response, or the most interesting response. Because that partly is what comes from me as an anthropologist. I think that people's own self-understanding is often so much more existentially significant than anything that can be said about them from the outside. And to the extent that we are anthropologists or historians or whatever and want to understand a phenomena as complicated as this, it behooves us to understand what people themselves are saying about it, about themselves. And it's not really possible to come strictly from the outside and say, I know who you are better than you know who you are. There may be things that an outsider can see that an insider has difficulty seeing. There are plenty of things that an insider sees that an outsider has difficulty seeing. And so I'm really an advocate of trying to toggle back and forth between these perspectives. So if you're Hasidic and you're out there watching this, please don't be offended by anything that I might say, even if it's not exactly how you view your world or your movement. I completely get that. And I have no desire to try to represent you in a way that you don't want to be represented. I can only talk about the phenomenon as I've come to understand it and as it's impacted on my life. And similarly, if you're a mitnaged, there may even be some mitnagdim left who are watching this, or if you're a secularist or a non-Jew, take everything I have to say with a grain of salt. Okay? And I don't know when the last time you heard an academic lecturer say that, but take everything I'm going to say with a grain of salt. And that will save us both a lot of trouble. Okay, now that's just the setup. I came to this question not as an academic. I came to this question as a teenager, growing up in New York in a Jewish but non-observant home. And like many people, I encountered Hasidism, not through Hasidim, but through writers like Martin Buber and Elie Wiesel, to a lesser extent, Abraham Joshua Heschel, just for whatever biographical reasons. But really, Buber and Wiesel made a tremendous impact on me when I was in high school. I read Souls on Fire, and then all of Wiesel's other collections of Hasidic stories. And I was very moved by them and taken by them. And this was long before I started reading academic scholarship. I found out that the academics don't all like what Martin Buber had to say. And it was certainly before I read Hasidic texts myself, or met Hasidim myself, which is a different thing. I grew up 20 minutes away from 770 Eastern Parkway, but you may not believe me when I say the Lubavitch Rebbe was not a presence in my life growing up that I was aware of in any way. That wasn't in the bubble in which I lived. And now I may wish that I had those experiences, but I didn't. I went through a phase in high school when I became very enamored of spiritual figures in general. Mahatma Gandhi, the film Gandhi came out when I was 15. I became a vegetarian. I became a pacifist. I watched it 16 times. I made my grandparents watch it with me a few times. I can't watch it now, but at the time it was life-changing for me. And I mention this because a second life-changing event was riding a bus in Queens Center, where I was, and I'm reading a book on great thinkers in pacifism, which I got to because of Mahatma Gandhi. And in there is an essay by Martin Buber. And this is the letter that Buber writes in response to Gandhi in 1938, 1939, something like that, Palestine. Gandhi has come out and said the Jews ought to engage civil disobedience against Hitler, and they should not hide under the protection of British bayonets in Palestine. And Martin Buber writes what I think is one of the greatest letters of modern Jewish history, which is a 20 or 30 page response to Gandhi, whom he respects, but who he says, Gandhi, you don't understand the Jewish condition. You don't understand. This is not England. This is not India. Right? Nobody could stand up and utter a single sentence of a speech like you gave in South Africa in contemporary Germany, right? Or under the German occupation. Not a single sentence. There's no free press. And Buber says, I mean, it's a defense of Zionism. I think it's wonderful to read it that way. But Buber says at one point, if I had been alive at the time of the founder of Christianity, he says, I don't think I would have been among the people who crucified him, but I also would not have been among his supporters. And the reason is that sometimes you have to stand up and fight against evil, and it's inappropriate to turn the other cheek if that means giving over history to demonic forces. That's Martin Buber, who, by the way, remained a man of the left and a tremendous, believer in rapprochement between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, right? So this was not a revisionist right-winger, but he understood, I think, the conditions under which he lived. And this hit me like a ton of bricks. It hit me like a ton of bricks because I was just getting my head around what it meant to I grew up in New York. Jews were all over the place. I knew I was Jewish. I had some, I had a bar mitzvah. I had some inkling of what that meant. But to put it into a broad historical framework, here's a people who, remember, I was born in 1968. Okay, so that's a year after the 67 war. My great-grandparents lost family members in the Holocaust, which were never spoken about. Never spoken about. I found out about them when I did genealogical research when I was an adult or a young adult. So suddenly seeing myself as part of this unfolding story, which is a dynamic story and a tragic story, and in many ways an inspiring story, was something that changed my life. And then, eventually had me moving to Israel and becoming a scholar of Jewish studies and many other things. One of the things that it led me to, this sort of discovery, was ultimately to studying in a traditional yeshiva where we study Talmud, Bible, law codes. And also I was lucky enough to be exposed to teachers who taught Hasidism of a variety of different kinds. Some of the teachers of Hasidism that I learned from the most and the best were not Hasidim themselves, but they were like me, fellow travelers who appreciated the teaching, even if it wasn't one that they could full-heartedly subscribe to for one reason or another. And I say all this because, if I'm talking or writing about it, you deserve to know where I am. This is a teaching that I find to this day enormously powerful and enervating and enlivening, and that I also have some recoil from time to time when I think about it in particular ways. And different people may have different kinds of recoil. They may be concerned about gender relations or whatever it is, or Zionism, or whatever contemporary political issues divide the Jewish people. But for me, that wasn't really it. For me, there was something a little bit more fundamental that I had trouble getting my head around for a long time. And I'm going to share with you in the little time we have left now, just some of the outlines of what that concern is, hopefully to provoke thought and conversation here and later on. Okay, I'm going to try to share a screen here, and if I don't succeed, then Ariel is going to help me. Ariel, what do you see?
It says screen broadcast. We don't see the sources.
Hold on just a second. There you go. Do you see it now?
Got it. Great,
okay.
Don.
I'm just gonna run through a very few of these. This is not a whole involved source sheet, but I want to give you a sense of where some of this is grounded. Okay, for me, for many people, but for me, the fundamental Jewish gesture is Abraham. Abraham, whether it be the circumcision or the Akedat Yitzchak or the hospitality that he shows for others, his Gemilut Chasadim. This, by the way, is true for Maimonides. It's fascinating when Maimonides has to answer the question, who should a Jewish person try to emulate? Right? Like the Christians have imitatio Christi and the Muslims have a kind of imitatio Muhammad. Who should the Jews try to imitate ethically in their personality? He doesn't choose Moses. He chooses Abraham. And that's a profound choice, which I've written about somewhere else. I'm not going to get into it now, but I identify with that. Okay, so Abraham is where it begins for us. And I want to bring you just one quick teaching to show how these two approaches to Jewish life differ in reading this story. Okay, I'm quoting, of course, from Genesis 18. You have the English there. The Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Him there is obviously talking about Abraham. In the sweep of the story, he's just been circumcised at the age of 100. He's recovering. And as the rabbis read it, he's sitting out in his tent, recovering with the breeze. It was a difficult and serious operation at the age of 100. And he looks out and he sees people, messengers, whoever they might have been, coming towards him in the desert. Visa enav vayar, he lifted up his eyes and he saw 3 men coming towards him. Vayar, and he saw them. Vayaratzli kratam mipetach ha'oel v'yishtachu arza, and he ran to greet them from the opening of the tent, and he bowed down. Okay, read on its most simple level, this is a gesture of hospitality par excellence. Here's an old man who's recovering from a difficult surgery. He sees people coming towards him in the desert. He doesn't know who they are. He doesn't know who they might be. The Midrash plays it up even more. They're idolaters, whatever they are. He rushes out to greet them and to welcome them in. And he says to them, Vayomer, he says, please, Adonai, im lo matzati chen be'enecha, al na ta'avor me'alavdecha. Please, my Lord or my lords, depending on how you want to translate it, if it please you, don't go on past, stay here in my tent. Let me give you hospitality. let a little water be brought to bathe your feet, recline it, right? This is one of the fundamental episodes that define, in my sense, what a Jewish covenant is. And the covenant focuses inward, but it also opens outward. It's about a way of engaging with the world, as well as engaging with one's own family and people. And this is it. This is what the Torah decides to portray Abraham as doing momentarily after his circumcision, which in a sense that some people have used, makes him, as it were, the first Jewish person. Okay, now, this is, anybody recognize him? I don't know where the picture comes from, but this is a picture of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the person attributed the founding of the Hasidic movement. You see him staring off a little bit contemplatively into the distance there. And I want to note how he reads this story. Okay, fundamentally, and I didn't bring the whole quote here, but the Baal Shem Tov says the following very interesting thing. When it says that Abraham looked and he saw God, and then in the very next verse it says he looked and he saw 3 people coming towards him, those were the same act of sight, the same act of vision. In other words, to see the 3 people coming towards you is to see the divine presence. And of course, they turn out to be angels, but Abraham doesn't know that. And I don't think that's the Baal Shem Tov's point either. I think his point is that the human being becomes a kind of translucent vessel for us to encounter the divine. And he says here, ha'oreach haba hu hamevi Torah lebal habayit, ulefi ha'oreach kachu Torah shnitgale lebal habayit. This is a saying of the Baal Shem Tov that was attributed to him by his grandson in the book Degel Machne Ephraim. The guest who comes towards you brings you Torah, right? If you're the host, Torah comes with the guest. And according to the stature of the guest, such is the Torah that is revealed to the host. Okay, we're not talking about the fact that he came and brought a Dvar Torah for the Shabbat table. We're talking about the fact that you received a revelation by virtue of his or her presence in your tent. And if you, that one Hebrew word that I have in large letters, ha'oreach, can be divided into or chet, the light of the 8th sphera, which is Bina, which is the source of prophecy and understanding. Okay, so the Baal Shem Tov wants you to see, if I'm reading this correctly, and I think there are other sources that go in the same direction, he wants you to see a seamless connection between God and the other person, or you're welcoming God and welcoming the other person. It's one act. It's one act. Okay, there's some inner complexity there, but it's not 2 different acts. Okay, if you have questions, please send them to Ariel, and I promise I will try to get to them. Now, why am I having trouble going down to the next page? I don't know, but I am having trouble going down to the next page. So I'm just going to tell you what's on the next page. If I had it to share with you, the next page was a picture of another rabbi from about 150 years later, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, otherwise known as Nitziv. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was a member of the, oh, there you go. Thank you, Ariel. Was a member of the Mitnaged camp, right? The non-Hasidic camp. He was a very humble person. He wasn't somebody who went around looking for fights with Hasidim. He was one of the teachers of Rav Kook, and some of Rav Kook's own sort of political tolerance comes from the Beit Midrash of the Nitziv. He was the co-head of the yeshiva in Volozhin for a long time, which, as they sort of say, was the Harvard of Eastern Europe. I prefer to think that Harvard is the Volozhin of Cambridge, but be that as it may. Okay, the Nitziv reads this story very differently. If you could scroll down a little bit, Ariel, to his words. I didn't translate this, but I'm going to translate it for you now. He notes in his commentary on the Torah, Ha'amek Davar, the name of his commentary on the Torah, that the verses say Vayar twice. Abraham saw twice. So Netziv says, this is a little bit odd. If it's talking about the same act of seeing, why does it repeat it twice? It must be that Abraham saw two different things. And without belaboring the language, here's what Abraham saw. First, Abraham saw God. He had just been circumcised. He was sitting and meditating on his love of God, and the Shekhinah was about him. He was having a revelation of divine presence and love. That's what Abraham saw. And then something happened. He noticed something in the distance. He looked up, oh, these three guys coming towards me. And in the Netziv's reading, Abraham says something extraordinary. He says, hold on, God. Maybe I'll be able to be back later, but I have something I have to do now. And he goes out to greet the guests. And the Netziv says this very powerfully. He says, even though he was busy attending to his love of God, which is also a great pleasure, maybe the greatest pleasure, and also a mitzvah, a commandment in and of itself, at that moment, when he saw three people marching toward him in the desert, and he knew that they needed food and water and a place to sit in the shade, that became a mitzvah habali ado, a commandment that came into his hand that he couldn't delegate to somebody else. And his love of God at that moment became secondary. Because the Netziv's point of view is that, of course, interacting with other people is not quite the same as meditating about the divine presence. And interacting with other people is not the same as interacting with the Shekhinah, the presence of God, directly. And when I interact with other people, you know what I do? I think about them and I focus on their needs. And I'm not thinking about what God needs at that moment. And here you have, in my view, encapsulated a fundamental ethical difference between the way Hasidim and Mitnagdim tend to see the world. Tend, okay? Don't bring me, everybody's going to bring me some example of an exception. The world is complex. God is great. I understand it. But nevertheless, I think this is a trend that we see over and over. And the trend goes something like this. Hasidim, when they talk about social ethics, or when they talk about interpersonal ethics, or when they talk about the sacredness of another human being, tend to frame it as running through their love of God. In other words, the other person almost becomes an instantiation of the divine presence. And my relationship with the other person, particularly if they're Jewish, particularly if they're a fellow Hasid, is what they sometimes describe as dibuk chaverim, right? Which is the same word of cleaving that's applied to God, right? To try to become one with others, which is very, very powerful. And you can see this running throughout Hasidic literature in many, many, many places. And the Hasidic movement, as was pointed out by many early historians, had a whole social dimension. It's debated how much the social dimension, but they cared about the people and they wanted the people to understand that they cared about them. But here you see that care and love and tenderness in some way is not separate from this moment of worship. That's really powerful. Now, why does the Netziv not see it that way? What could be wrong with that beautiful, beautiful vision? And yet he's at pains to point this out. And I find it hard to believe that it's not because he's aware, if not of this particular teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, he's aware that there's this other way of thinking about things out there. He's a smart guy, right? He didn't have to be polemic in order to polemicize. And the Netziv is saying, oh, hold on. This is all beautiful. But for most of us, first of all, it's just not true. For most of us, it's not true that when we interact with another person, it's exactly the same as if we were meditating on God or interacting with the Shekhinah. It's something else. And that something else is not an inferior thing. It's not, right? But it's a great thing. And he quotes the Talmud, which says, Gadol achnasat orchim me'akbalat pnei Shekhinah. Greater is the receiving of guests than the receiving of the divine presence. And then Netziv says, yeah, that's meant literally. In other words, you may be communing with God. You may be lost in prayer. but that person comes by your tent and needs a drink of water, your obligation is to set God aside and go bring a cup of water to that person, whether or not you see them as the divine presence at that time. And this leads to a different kind of ethics, in my view. Not necessarily better or worse, but it's a different kind of ethics. And to me, the question really is, and you see this expressed in the Musar movement, who come out of this same sort of non-Hasidic way of thinking about the world, although they had their own problems with the Mitnagdim. But if you read through the Musar literature, you can't get two sentences without somebody talking about the other person and what does the other person's do. Because it's not that they're identical with me, and it's not that I love them because deep down it's only our bodies that divide us and we have one soul, but no, they're another person. And that otherness has ontological dignity. And so if I want to know how to treat another person, I first have to allow them to be another person. Now, our time is running short, so I'm going to make a vast and drastic claim, which you can feel free to ignore or to use as fodder for conversation. I think that this exact feature can be traced in some ways back to medieval times, but I'm not going to go there right now. But it can also be traced forward into modern times among modern Jewish thinkers. And I think you see this fairly clearly in the split between, let's say, Emmanuel Levinas on one side, who very self-consciously comes out of the school of Volozhin. He writes about Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. Now, by the way, I know from a family member that Levinas also read Tanya, and he marked up his copy of the Tanya. We died, but I don't know what he thought about it because he didn't write about it. He did write about Volozhin, and what he wrote about Volozhin was exactly this: that you have to sometimes engage yourself in a tzimtzum kipshuto, in a kind of literal self-restraint, a minimization of self-regard, a giving a place to the other, not because of some deep spiritual understanding of who they are or what they represent, or the fact that God shines through them, but just because they're another person. They have a claim upon us. They have a claim. And I think if you look on the other side at somebody like Martin Buber, or Abraham Joshua Heschel, or some other figures, and again, this is complicated. They're not all saying exactly the same thing, but I think you can show that they are coming at this from a more Hasidic point of view. And this goes back to a medieval debate about what it means to honor God, which is where all of this started to begin with, right? Levinas goes back to Maimonides and says, you know what it means to honor God? It means to recognize that you can't see or understand God at all. He goes back to Maimonides. Martin Buber, when he translates the Hebrew Bible, he translates the name of God as presence. Presence. And when Levinas talks about God, he talks about God as absence. Now, presence and absence and presence, they're not necessarily as divergent maybe as we think. There's presence that requires absence. There's absence that requires, but nevertheless, the music behind these different teachings is a different music. It's not that it's incompatible, but it's different. Now, different people are going to be drawn to different aspects of a teaching as broad and as deep as Jewish teaching. If they're drawn to it at all, then they're going to be drawn to different parts of it. And I will confess that I myself feel a certain tension, because as much as I find spirituality and vigor and vitality in Hasidic teaching and in Hasidic texts, and at least in my own small way in Hasidic life, I often wind up coming up against this idea that there's something missing for me. And what's missing is that sense of limit, of otherness, of an ethics which is about the other being other just because that's who they are, without having to have a metaphysical justification for it. But that is the metaphysical justification. And the Netziv, of course, says this in the language of Jewish law. He says, when a commandment comes to your hand, you have to drop everything to do it. And even if everything is studying Torah or praying, which to him means encountering the divine presence, but you have to put that down in order to go do a physical mitzvah, which might include bringing somebody in the desert a glass of water. We can have a longer conversation some other time about how these two different ethics, I think, have played themselves out in modern Jewish life for good and for ill, honestly, on probably on both sides, for good and for ill. But my specific set of experiences that I've had have made me more wary, I guess, than maybe somebody else would be about any claim to the merging of selves, the idea that we all love each other so deeply that our desires and our needs are merged into one another. It's a beautiful idea, but it's one that raises some problems for me. So I guess I'll pause here and see if any questions came in, and we can have a little bit of a conversation. And again, I just want to thank very much the organizers for the invitation to be.
Thank you, Don, for such a thought-provoking and erudite talk. As the questions begin to roll in, and I have no doubt that they will, I'm going to give myself the honor of asking the first question, which is a sort of two-part question, which is that I'd like to push you to think with us. This first approach that you've described for the Hasidim is a very Buberian one. And I wonder, can we not really see the textures and the complexities of the person in front of us, even if they are a translucent vessel for divinity? The notion that Buber has and the formulation that he has, particularly in the second half of his career, involves the realization of God presence in this world precisely through the encounter with other human beings. And, he describes it as the road to God leading through the heart of one's fellow. And I understand what's powerful about that, but I'd like to also think, what are the problems in specific that you see with that? Where does that ethical framework let one down, or what sort of conundrums does it force one into? And the other is thinking with the Netziv as a sort of indication of the other side of this debate. What does one lose when one describes Tzimtzum Kifshuto, or this withdrawal of the self to make room for the other? Does one pay a price for that normative ethic also? Yeah.
So I'm gonna as Maimonides says, answer the second question first, and then the first question second. The question of what you lose by emphasizing this kind of difference, and by difference I really mean incommensurability between God and humans, between one person and another. There's something really incommensurate there. I can't assume that my experience is like your experience. So what you stand to lose there is a sense of warmth and vitality if you're not careful. And, the old joke about the Kalta Misnagid, the sort of cold-hearted Misnagid, which was always a stereotype. And, whatever, I know very nice, warm Mitnagdim who are very kind to people. But there's something there. In other words, the world becomes disenchanted. Now, we live in a disenchanted world, right? I mean, we know that before Jewish studies. We know that from Max Weber and from, right? We live in a world in which little by little, angels and God and spirits and ancestors and all of these things have been pushed to the side or made irrelevant or not real, little by little by little. And there's a sense in which the Mitnagdim have an easier time with that, I think, because who needs all that, right? You have Torah. Torah is how you connect to God. And even though, Reb Chaim of Volozhin did exorcisms, I mean, if you look in the back of the Nefesh HaChaim, so I don't want to make this claim too broad, but the world does become disenchanted in a way that you could either find constricting or you could find freeing. And different people, different situations may call for different things. Now, this leads me to your first question. What could possibly be the downside of this kind of spiritualistic vision? So first of all, I'll note, I'm not a Martin Buber scholar per se, but he underwent some sort of change also in the course of his career. And there's a very pregnant moment at which he says, I'm turning away from mysticism because he felt that it had caused him to fail a student of his who had committed suicide. And he came to feel that he wasn't present enough and didn't respond enough. So I don't know exactly how to frame Martin Buber's career in all of this, right? The Martin Buber of the Hasidic studies, I think, is also an earlier Martin Buber, but I could be wrong about that. Let me ask you the following question. Imagine, I don't want to give too many details because of the evil eye, but imagine that something terrible happened to you or to somebody that you love. Which do you find more comforting? That God did this because it's all part of some immense plan, or that sometimes things just happen without there having to be a reason for them. The Hasidic view, God is everywhere, God is in all things, leit atar panui mineh, is also a view of providence, hashgacha pratit. It's not the Ramban, as some people think. It's the Baal Shem Tov who said, not a leaf turns in the dust without God deciding where that leaf is going to go and what ant is going to, feast on that leaf when it gets there. Everything is a product of divine will. That can be as a human being, that can be an extraordinary, powerful, strengthening statement, but it can also feel suffocating. And I think that my natural inclination is to feel more suffocated by it, as opposed to Maimonides, who says, you know what, you got hit by a bus. It's not because God said you were going to get hit by that bus. It's because you stepped out into the street without looking. And even though, in a sense, that makes my death not meaningful, right? But as Andre Nair once said beautifully, people don't mind God speaking. It's other people speaking on God's behalf that they mind. So for somebody to come and tell me either that they understand the reason or at least that there is a reason, if only I could get my head around it, is sometimes quite offensive. And one of the things you see, it's very interesting. Take a look at a character like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So post-Holocaust, right? So many people asked him questions about the meaning of the Holocaust, as is not surprising. He didn't answer those questions, right? I mean, there were Hasidic writers, including his father-in-law, who wrote during the war about sort of messianic happenings, and everything was. And I don't know what the Lubavitcher Rebbe believed, but I do know that he didn't seem to think it was useful to tell people that when they come to ask about anguish, right? In other words, somebody comes to you and says, the world has been devoured, my family is gone, and God has a plan. So in our modern days, many of us have read the Brothers Karamazov, which, Ivan Karamazov, that was the next slide, it doesn't matter. Ivan Karamazov goes through this with his brother Alyosha, who's studying to be an Orthodox Christian monk. And there you go. There's an artist's rendering of Ivan. And Ivan says, is there in the whole world a being who would have the right to forgive and could forgive? This is after a whole story about the terrible, terrible suffering of a child. From love for humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with the unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unjustified indignation, even if I were wrong. That's very Dostoevsky. Besides, too high a price to pay is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. And so I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. He's talking about his ticket to paradise. I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. And if I'm an honest man, I'm bound to give it back as soon as possible. And that I'm doing. It's not God that I don't accept Alyosha, only I most respectfully return him the ticket. This is a profound, profound statement of a modern condition that I experience, and that when I read, I thought, that had a rig of truth to it. I mean, I'm not modeling my life on Fyodor Dostoevsky for a lot of reasons, but that has a ring of truth to it. And I think that many people in the wake of the Holocaust had that same kind of reaction. And if you look at the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Soloveitchik, these major teachers after the Holocaust, they tended to shy away from trying to explain. That's not true across the board. Every once in a while, there's still a disaster in Israel, and some rabbi says it's because, you did this or that. But I think Jews have a harder and harder time accepting that as their history has become harder and harder to bear. So I guess, to me, that's the downside. The downside is, does this force you to take somebody else's suffering and turn it into, a stitch in a story that somebody else is telling? Maybe it is. I mean, who knows, right? I don't know. But I rebel against that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, and although there's divergence among different kinds of Hasidic teaching about this, as you and I have both talked about, the idea that the way that I become unified both with God and with my fellow is through a sort of self-nullification on a very profound level is a very powerful spiritual idea. It's also one that I have trouble with. Right? All my Chabad friends are shaking their heads. That's your problem, right? I know that's your problem, exactly. It's also because I don't like to drink, but those are two related problems possible. But Rabbi Soloveitchik said something once I found fascinating. He said, Talmud study is by itself somewhat atheistic in the sense that you're studying the text, you're not thinking about God. You can't be thinking about God because then you'll never understand, the law of torts or the laws of purity. And Rav Chaim of Volozhin, his ancestor, said, so study Talmud for Talmud's sake, Torah for Torah's sake. Every once in a while, you stop and meditate about God. That's fine, right? So you shouldn't forget what you're doing. But at that moment when you're cognizing Torah, so you can't be thinking about God. It doesn't work. And I have this suspicion that for most of us who are not great tzaddikim, we can't really cognize another person when we're thinking about God either. So that's my challenge, and that's I guess where I remain stuck.
Thank you so much for that eloquent formulation. I mean, in a certain sense, it reminds me of Heschel retreating away from panentheism or pantheism or whatever we might want to call it toward a personal God, a kind of mythic God that doesn't necessarily explain the Holocaust, but then he famously reorients those questions really back to the world of human ethics. And his understanding of God is very much one in which the projection goes from the encounter with another human being onto the divine as opposed to the other way around.
Right.
I think it is true that Buber throughout his entire life loved Hasidism, but he changes in his reading of it. And he changes profoundly as reading it from a kind of mysticism in the first half of his life to a kind of communitarian or at least socially embedded way of thinking in the second. And just one other thing that came to mind is that when you were talking about the limitations of the translucency model where you see everyone as vessels for divinity, I'm thinking of this very poignant moment in which Hillel Zeitlin, a journalist and Jewish thinker who loved Hasidism in the first half of the 20th century and was killed in the Holocaust, he after World War I, he imagines an interview with the Baal Shem Tov and asks him to justify his theory of providence in a world after the killing fields.
Do you think he read Dostoevsky?
I'm sure he did. Yeah, he actually refers to him.
Fascinating. Right. I haven't read that. I need to see that.
I'll send it to you. So we have some questions here. Don, can you see them? Do you want me to field them and read them aloud?
I think I can see them. Let me just a second. Yeah, actually, if you can read them aloud for everybody, that would be great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to read three questions and you can choose which ones you'd like to answer. The first one is, what are the effects of these two approaches on modern Jewish life? I think we've talked about that in some, but you can also dive deeper. A second from Marta Fischer. I've read a lot of Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas. After making Aliyah, I got introduced to the thought of Isaiah Leibowitz, Yeshayahu Leibovich. And I'd like to know your opinion about this amazing thinker. Thank you. And from Juliet Hedrick, is this social mysticism of Hasidism, does it help explain the current reluctance to enforce COVID restrictions, paring down weddings, hiding space behind masks, and things like that?
So, you can ask me to talk about God, and, I assume people won't throw things through my window, but don't ask me to talk about COVID. I'm not sure, Juliet. I have to let that roll around in my mind a little bit. Look, Yeshayahu Leibowitz is almost a folklorish character. There's a story that he was in the hospital, and the rabbi of the hospital came by with tefillin for him to put on, which the rabbi in the hospital in Israel does. But after giving him the tefillin, he said, it's a skula. It will help you. It will help you heal. It will help you feel better. And Yeshayahu Leibowitz threw him out on his ear because he said, Maimonides says that if you use a mitzvah that way, that's heresy, right? Mitzvot are not there to heal you. They're there to be fulfilled. And he throws the guy out. Well, that's a story. I don't know if it's true. I heard the story. So I love that story, and I appreciate it. But I've had a lot of trouble identifying with Yeshayahu Leibowitz, including his readings of Maimonides, which I think are, forgive me, but I think are very often really forced because he's not willing to admit anything outside of the law. Right? So what is Judaism? It's the law. That's all that there is. And on one hand, that's very liberating, right? Because there's all sorts of stuff that is accreted to Judaism, which you can sort of, push to the side, and you don't have to take the tefillin to cure cancer or whatever. But I don't think it's really a defensible view of any historical school of thought that I'm aware of. Certainly not Maimonides. Maimonides thought that philosophy and kind of knowing God through intellectual mysticism was at the heart of his plan, right? So somebody said to me recently, and this also I don't know if it's true, but somebody said to me recently that Rabbi Soloveitchik used to say that the Guide of the Perplexed was not very important, not an important book. Unlike the Mishneh Torah, the Code of Law, which was, he spent most of his life trying to figure out. So I don't know if that's true, but if it's true, I'm not sure how you can understand the Mishneh Torah correctly without the guide. In other words, I'm a student of his son-in-law, the late Rabbi Professor Twersky, and I don't see how the law and the philosophy of the law can really be dissociated from one another. So I've had a hard time with Yeshayahu Leibowitz on that level. I mean, again, he's acerbic and he's liberating because there are all kinds of orthodoxies, and he's usually willing to, put to rest any orthodoxy you bring to him, whether it's a Zionist orthodoxy or a religious orthodoxy. But I guess I haven't found for myself in him what's supposed to take the place. And again, that's about a very particular moment. I mean, here is sort of a bastion, sort of an almost hyper mitnagid, right? Many of the great mitnagdic thinkers embraced mysticism. They embraced spirituality. They embraced all kinds of things, right? Some of them believed in magic, right? They lived in a somewhat enchanted world, at least, or not maybe exactly like the Hasidim, but there was enchantment in the world. And I feel as if Leibovich is too fast to try to make everything coherent by banishing everything to the sides. And I guess there's some philosopher that says this, I don't know who it is, but I guess in the end, I have to think that life is more messy than that. And so I can't believe that within a Jewish framework, there's not room for that inconsistency, right? Because how do you put it all together? We don't know how to put it all together. And if you read through, I mean, Maimonides was one of the most coherent writers in history. From the time he was a child to the time he was an old man, most of his fundamental beliefs are there, right? I mean, there's a change here and there. There's not a whole lot of change. And scholars who have tried to find, real movement in his thought, I think have not really succeeded. And yet, even so, you can't always figure out exactly how one thing that he said corresponds to another thing that he said, even in the same book, right? So God is great. The world is great. It's hard for me to imagine that we could put the whole world in our teacup and understand what it is. And I apologize if that's unfair. I didn't know Yeshayahu Leibowitz. I haven't read all of his books, but that's just my impression from what I have read. In terms of COVID, yeah, I think I'm not going to touch it, largely because I don't know. Is vaccine resistance greater among Hasidim than among ultra-Orthodox Mitnagdim? Intuitively, I would say yes, but I don't really know. So I would hesitate to say. But the one thing I would say is, okay, here I'll go out on a limb. I'm also a medical anthropologist, right? So I'm willing to go out on this limb. Being resistant to expert authority. Let's just say in the broad way. Doesn't mean in every case. But the principle of being resistant to expert authority, I think is very healthy. And any society that can stand the test of time has to be willing sometimes to say, we understand better than the scholars, because the scholars are constantly telling us that our existence is not possible or untrue or silly. Orthodox Jews would not exist if in the 19th century they had all listened to the experts about their inevitable demise, or in the early 20th century about their inevitable demise. So I'm, as an academic who sees how the sausages get made, I'm very comfortable with skepticism about academic authority. I think there should be more skepticism within academia, but I also think you have to weigh. Not every case is the same, right? I mean, I'm not going to stand here and try to dissuade people from being vaccinated, because I think they ought to be vaccinated. But are you still there?
Don, have we lost you?
I don't know if those were the ghosts of Facebook or something. I'm sorry, I got cut off. But anyway, so I'm not going to defend an anti-vaxxer position here. All I'm saying is that I think that it pays to look carefully at whatever comes out of people's mouths and studies and whatever. And sometimes the experts get it right, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes it's in between. And we're seeing now, right, as time goes by, many claims that were treated as really, really true a year ago are being revised. That's normal. Right? I don't view that as evidence of a great conspiracy. But, there's a wonderful German historian named Braun, who's written about this in the German context, not the American context. Maybe I can get away with it. And she says that the world is divided into what she calls techno-pessimists and techno-optimists. And techno-optimists tend to be people who believe in rule by experts, right? Technocrats. And technocrats are the people who should make the decisions. So you know who should decide whether we do stem cell research? Stem cell researchers, right? That's how that goes. And you know who should decide, how much carbon is allowed into the air? Climate scientists. And, everybody's got their niche. Techno-pessimists tend to think that technology is not going to solve all of the problems. There's something in the human condition that is not entirely plastic. And therefore, they also tend to think that governance should be more broadly distributed, right? Including a hopefully educated citizenry who are not experts. And that's sort of the American system, right? When people are elected to office, hopefully they listen to the good things that experts have to say, but the reason they're in office is to make those decisions, and not just to kind of channel, whatever came out of the CDC that week, which of course is also political, right? It's not only see, this is the thing, not only political, but it's also political. And just to stay on topic, so with respect to Hasidim as well, or Mitnagdism as well, this is social construction. It's just that it's not only social construction, right? There are people who are trying to understand a Torah that is not completely internal to them. There are people trying to understand a set of interactions with the divine that are not purely internal and subjective to them. And that's what makes a world, an intersubjective world, possible. We learn how to share certain kinds of understandings of things. And that's how we go around in the world and we do things. So I don't want to be solipsist about it, but I think that it's important not to get too carried away by the claims that any group, whether it be rabbis or scientists or that any group makes about their own sources of knowledge. And that includes, of course, anthropologists, right? So anyway, that's what I have to say about that. The other question about modern Jewish thought, Ariel Evan Mays, who's sitting before us, has put out a wonderful 2-volume book on roots and branches in Hasidism, together with Arthur Green. My chapter, which is where a lot of this talk comes from, appears there. So feel free to read it, but get the book, because there's a lot of better stuff in that book than what I've written. So thank you very, very much.
Well, wherever you are, join me in thanking Professor Don Seaman, thanking our hosts here at Polin, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, the rest of your day, and take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.